The floor moved beneath my boots hard enough to throw my shoulder into the bulkhead. A heartbeat later, every pressure alarm in Pelagic Crown began screaming. I grabbed the rail before the second tremor hit and watched a hairline of condensation race across the transparent wall beside me. Beyond it waited 11 kilometers of black alien ocean, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh and heavy enough to crush our city into scrap if the pressure shell ever forgot its job. "Jonah!" Commander Asha Calder's voice came through my earpiece. Calm, flat, almost irritatingly normal. I was already running. "Maintenance Junction 7, I said. "Outer load just jumped 8%. "Cause?" "Ask the planet." "I'm asking my engineer." That is the engineer's answer. For half a second, I heard something that might have been a laugh. Then her tone changed. "Lower habitation rings are losing ballast control. Get me options." I rounded the corner into a transit shaft packed with humans and Virellans moving in opposite directions without colliding. That was Pelagic Crown. Humans in gray pressure suits. Virellans in their long dark blue coats, their narrow faces shining faintly under emergency lights. 2 species. 1 city. 9 centuries of peace had made our cooperation so ordinary that nobody thought about it anymore. My great-grandfather's great-grandfather had been born after the last human-Virellan war. To me, the Empire was not some ancient enemy from a history archive. It was the civilization that manufactured half the station's pressure doors. It was my neighbor Yuri complaining about my cooking. It was Virellan children playing in human gravity gyms because they liked jumping higher than their parents. It was Commander Calder arguing with Imperial administrators every week and still inviting them to drink after. Pelagic Crown itself had been built that way. The Virellans had sunk the first foundation into the ocean floor centuries ago. Humans had added our own engineering after the Alliance began. The 2 construction systems met at a thick silver seam running around the central command levels. Every schoolchild on the station knew the story. The Virellan frame carried vertical pressure. The human frame distributed lateral strain. Neither half could survive the full load alone. Someone had once called the seam a monument to peace. Engineers had less poetic language for it. We called it the place where everything broke if either side got stupid. That morning, the planet was already trying. I reached Junction 7 and found 3 Virellan technicians fighting a manual pressure wheel. One of them, Tavin, saw me and pointed. "Your compensator has locked." "My compensator?" "It has human writing on it. It was built in an Imperial factory. Then your people contaminated it with optimism." Another tremor hit. We both stopped joking. The pressure gauge climbed. I dropped beside the control housing, pulled the maintenance panel, and found a warped actuator trembling in its socket. "Command Quill." Asha answered immediately. "Go. We can stabilize lower rings if we dump 2 auxiliary ballast chambers." "How long?" 20 minutes before we need them back." "Civilians?" "Approximately 6,000 in the affected sectors." "Do it." Another voice entered the channel. Sharp male, Imperial. "No." Everyone in the junction looked at me as if they could hear it through my skull. Prefect Soren Havoc, the highest-ranking Virellan authority on Pelagic Crown. Technically, Asha commanded joint defense and emergency response. Technically, Havoc controlled Imperial civil administration. 9 centuries of bureaucracy had produced several thousand pages, explaining what happened when those authorities overlapped. Nobody had written the page for 6,000 people under a failing ocean. Havoc continued. "Commander Calder, auxiliary ballast is reserved for strategic sectors. Lower districts are to be sealed. Ashad did not raise her voice. There are people down there. There are people everywhere. They are in immediate danger. The upper command ring contains Imperial continuity staff, military command, and planetary governance. We will not risk those sectors to save residential workers. I stared at the warped actuator in front of me. Tavin stopped moving. One of the other Virellans whispered something under his breath. I did not understand the phrase. I understood the tone. Ashah said, "Jonah, dump the chambers." Havoc answered before I could. "Engineer Quill, that order is countermanded under Imperial Emergency Authority." My hand hovered over the manual release. 9 centuries. That was the strange thing about peace. People imagined it as something dramatic. Flags, treaties, statues. It was mostly little things, whose order you obeyed when everyone had good reasons. Which technician trusted whose calculation? Whether a door opened because the person on the other side wore the wrong uniform. I had spent 12 years at Pelagic Crown and never once wondered whether an imperial order outranked a human one. Until then. "Jonah," Ashah said. "Just my name." I pulled the release. The chamber beneath us groaned as thousands of tons of ballast shifted. Pressure numbers dropped immediately. Somewhere below us, 6,000 people got another 20 minutes of life. Havoc's voice became very quiet. "You have violated an Imperial command." Ashah answered, "I prevented a mass casualty event." "You endangered Imperial continuity." "I protected Imperial citizens." "Those citizens were designated secondary." I looked at Tavin. He looked back at me. Neither of us said anything. Ashah did. "People are not ballast, prefect." Then the channel went dead. Not disconnected. Severed from Imperial command. Tavin exhaled. "That," he said, "will become paperwork." He had no idea. None of us did. The third quake damaged 3 lower transit tubes and cracked a geothermal intake. For the next 37 minutes, nobody had time for politics. We worked. Human crews rerouted power. Virellan engineers sealed a flooding coolant shaft. A Virellan medic crawled into a collapsing service, ducked to pull out 2 human children. A human shuttle pilot ignored 3 landing restrictions and packed 50 Imperial families into a vehicle rated for 32. It was ugly. Improvised. Familiar. Peace functioning under load. Then I was summoned to Central Command. The silver construction seam ran directly across the chamber floor. Human consoles occupied one side. Imperial control stations occupied the other. Nobody had designed it symbolically. That had not stopped generations of diplomats from turning it into one. Ashah stood on the human side. Havoc faced her from the Imperial side. Security surrounded both of them. I stayed near the rear door, still wearing a maintenance harness. "You authorized another evacuation transfer," Havoc said. Ashah glanced toward me as I entered. "Because another district was failing. Against direct Imperial instruction." "Yes." Havoc's skin had gone almost white, the Virellan equivalent of fury. "You are operating inside sovereign Imperial territory. We are operating inside a jointly governed installation. Under hospitality granted by the Empire." That got a reaction. Not from Ashah. From his own officers. Small movements. Eyes shifting. People remembering that humans had helped build the walls holding back the ocean. Ashah folded her hands behind her back. "If you want to renegotiate 9 centuries of joint command, Soren, choose a day when the city isn't coming apart." I am not renegotiating anything. No, you're trying to discover whether the word sovereignty can patch a pressure fracture. He stepped closer. You will surrender control of emergency infrastructure. No. You will return command access. No. You will instruct human personnel to obey Imperial evacuation priority. No. Each answer was quieter than the last. Havoc looked toward his guards. Something inside me tightened. Asha saw it. So did every officer in the chamber. Commander Calder, Havoc said, you are relieved of operational authority pending Imperial review. Asha turned slightly toward the human consoles. Continue civilian evacuation. 2 Imperial guards moved. Human security moved too. Weapons were not drawn. Not yet. Asha lifted one hand. Everyone stopped. She looked directly at Havoc. You want me removed? Fine. You can argue jurisdiction after the water stops trying to kill us, but the shelters stay open. Havoc's jaw tightened. Close lower access. No one moved. He looked toward an Imperial Systems officer. Close it. The officer swallowed. There are still civilians in transit. I gave you an order. The officer looked at the screens. Asha said nothing. That silence changed the room. Havoc understood it before I did. His authority was being tested. Not by humanity. By the existence of people who could see what his order meant. He turned toward the guards. Detain her. They stepped across the seam. Asha did not resist. One guard reached for her arm. Then an alarm sounded. Lower shelter 7. Structural failure imminent. My console flashed a red evacuation warning. 2,000 people. The shelter doors had been remotely locked from the Imperial network. Asha saw the display. So that's your answer, she said. She twisted away from the guard, reached across the human console, and hit the emergency override. The shelter doors began opening. Havoc shouted, "Stop her!" The nearest guard grabbed Asha. She drove her elbow backward not to injure him, just to break the hold. Her hand stayed on the controls. Override accepted, the system announced. Havoc drew his sidearm. I remember that detail more clearly than I remember the sound. His hand. Steady. His thumb releasing the safety. Asha turning toward him. Not frightened. Surprised. As though she had finally discovered the exact boundary of a man she had misjudged. Havoc said, "Step away from Imperial Systems." Asha looked at the evacuation counter. People were moving. She looked back at him. No. He fired. The shot hit her high in the chest. Asha staggered backward. Her boots crossed the silver seam. Then she fell directly across it. Human shoulders on one side. Human blood spreading across Imperial metal on the other. Nobody moved. Not for one heartbeat. Maybe 2. 9 centuries ended somewhere inside that silence. Then everything happened. I dropped beside Asha. Human security raised weapons. Imperial guards raised theirs. Someone screamed for a medic. Someone else shouted that Havoc had just fired on the Joint Commander. A Virellan officer slammed Havoc's weapon arm downward before he could shoot again. Tavan appeared from nowhere and dragged me away long enough for medics to reach Asha. Her eyes were open. Jonah. I'm here. Her breath sounded wrong. Wet. Thin. I need you to listen. No, you need to stop talking. The shelters. They're open. All of them. I checked the screen. Havoc's access network was still attempting closures. Not yet. Ashaz's fingers caught my sleeve. Then why are you sitting here? That was the last order she ever gave me. I stood. I went back to work. Human command did not declare war. That surprised Havoc. I think it frightened him more than if we had. Instead, every human-controlled system aboard Pelagic Crown dropped Imperial Command authentication. Defense, transit, power routing, emergency access, life support. We did not shut the Empire out of the city. We shut Imperial authority out of human systems. There was a difference. Havoc either did not understand it or refused to. His first message called it mutiny. His second called it occupation. His third ordered every human technician arrested. By then, we had opened the lower shelters. Virellan civilians poured upward through corridors we controlled. Nobody checked species. Nobody asked political loyalty. Nobody demanded an oath. We just moved people away from the failing hull. A Virellan mother shoved a child into my arms during a pressure door transfer and disappeared back through the crowd to find another. The girl could not have been older than 4. She wrapped 6 narrow fingers around my harness and asked whether the humans were leaving. I told her not yet. I did not tell her I had no idea what leaving meant anymore. 3 hours after the shooting, Ashad died. I learned through a private medical message while crawling through a ballast control tunnel. I read it once, then again. I sat in the dark with cold water dripping onto my neck and tried to think of something appropriate. Nothing came. No great speech. No rage. Only one ridiculous memory. Ashad once spent an entire night helping me trace a power fluctuation because she refused to go to bed while a residential block's heating system kept failing. She had known nothing about power distribution. She had mostly held a flashlight. At 4 in the morning, she had asked why engineers always swore at machines they had personally designed. I told her it encouraged accountability. That was what grief gave me. A flashlight. A bad joke. Then my console alerted. Imperial security was moving toward Shelter 12. I got up. The first human Virellan firefight in 9 centuries lasted 22 seconds. It happened outside a civilian shelter. Not over territory. Not over a fleet. Over a door. Havoc's troops ordered us to surrender control. The human Marines guarding the shelter refused. The Imperial officer in charge warned that the building was under lawful Imperial authority. The Marine lieutenant asked whether the civilians inside were under Imperial protection. The officer said yes. The lieutenant asked why Havoc had ordered the shelter sealed while they were still inside. That was when somebody fired. Nobody ever proved who. Afterward, it stopped mattering. 2 humans were wounded. 1 Imperial soldier died. The rest retreated. By the time their boots disappeared around the corridor, every person on Pelagic Crown knew. Peace was no longer an abstract treaty damaged by Havoc's bullet. Humans and Imperials had killed each other again. The old world was gone. Havoc broadcast an emergency declaration. He accused human personnel of seizing Imperial infrastructure. He ordered loyal citizens to move into government-controlled zones. Most did. Many did not. That was the beginning of his real defeat. Not ours. His. The Virellan technician who had saved my life that morning stayed at my side. So did Imperial medics, transit controllers, 3 pressure engineers, a kitchen supervisor who knew nothing about politics and everything about feeding 8,000 displaced people. Havoc called them collaborators. They called themselves busy. The geological crisis worsened. And that turned out to be the only reason Pelagic Crown survived the political one. Nobody had time to pretend the choices were theoretical. If a human engineer shut down, Virellans drowned. If a Virellan medic walked away, humans died. If an Imperial pilot obeyed an order to abandon the lower rings, his own family might be inside. 9 centuries of peace had done something Havoc had never accounted for. It had made us necessary to one another. Not governments. People. Imperial reinforcements arrived 14 hours after HFY was shot. 3 assault carriers settled into the ocean above Pelagic Crown. Their sonar pulses rolled through the station walls like distant thunder. Havoc sent me a personal message. I almost deleted it. Instead, I opened the channel. His face appeared over my maintenance display. "You are Engineer Quill. Still, you control the emergency grid. I maintain it. You are allowing armed human personnel to occupy Imperial sectors. I'm allowing pressure doors to remain open. You understand those systems belong to the Empire." I looked around the maintenance bay. 1 wall bore human manufacture marks. The pump assembly was Virellan. The control software had been rewritten by a mixed engineering team so many times nobody knew, whose code remained underneath. "No," I said, "I don't think anyone understands that anymore." His eyes narrowed. "You believe Commander Calder died, defending your right to steal an Imperial city." There it was. The mistake. Not cruelty. Something deeper. Ownership. He thought Pelagic Crown was an object. He thought peace was an object. Something the Empire possessed because it had lasted long enough. "HFY died opening a shelter," I said. "And now you are destroying everything she spent her life maintaining." I almost shouted at him. I wanted to. Instead, I remembered her holding that flashlight. "We're maintaining the city," I said. "You're the one trying to make it obey you." He ended the transmission. Minutes later, the assault began. I was not a soldier. That mattered. Every time someone handed me a weapon, I put it somewhere useful and went back to infrastructure. Pelagic Crown had more ways to stop an army than most armies understood. Transit tubes could be depressurized. Lift shafts could be flooded with ballast water. Maintenance locks could split a corridor into isolated pressure cells. Emergency partitions could reroute people through passages that did not exist on military maps, because only repair crews used them. I did not turn the station into a weapon. I turned it into an obstacle. There was a line in my head I refused to cross. HFY had not died to save civilians, so I could drown soldiers in sealed corridors. We trapped Imperial teams, redirected them, locked them in service sections, and opened safe withdrawal routes behind them. Sometimes they took the exits. Sometimes they fought. Humans died. Virellans died. Every death felt obscene. Not because war was new. Because these uniforms had stood beside one another for longer than any living person could remember. Then something began happening. Imperial soldiers stopped advancing. At first 1 squad. Then another. A Virellan officer contacted us from Transit 6. "We have orders to breach civilian shelter access." The human Marine beside me lifted his rifle. I raised a hand. "What are you asking?" The officer looked exhausted. "Whether your medical area will accept wounded Imperial personnel." "Yes." "Even armed?" "No." A pause. "Reasonable." 10 minutes later, 12 Virellan soldiers arrived carrying their wounded. They left their rifles on the floor outside. Not surrendered. Not prisoners. They simply refused to go back. Havoc called it treason. The word spread faster than his orders. The strongest quake hit during the second assault. Pelagic crown twisted. Not visibly. You never wanted to see a pressure structure move. But I felt it through my boots. A deep vibration. The kind that skipped hearing and went straight into bone. My display flooded with warnings. The old silver construction seam had begun separating near Central Command. For centuries, human and Virellan engineering had shared the ocean's weight. Now the station was physically doing what our governments had just done. Pulling apart. Tavin. He slid beside me. His face changed when he saw the readings. If that propagates, I know. We lose the central pressure ring. I know. Then stop saying you know and do something. That was why I liked him. We mapped the damage. One section of the seam had buckled inward. The emergency cross-connections were sealed by Imperial security to stop movement between human-held and government-held sectors. Those same sealed passages now prevented pressure equalization. If we left them closed, the central ring would fail. If we opened them, we gave Havoc's forces direct access to the largest human-controlled civilian shelter. I stared at the diagram. There were more than 12,000 people on our side. Another 5,000 trapped on his. Jonah, Tavin said. I see it. You cannot reinforce one half alone. I know. The joint frame was designed to share load. I know. He became quiet. I looked at him. He was staring at the silver line on the schematic. What? My grandmother used to tell me the seam proved our peoples had become wiser than our ancestors. Your grandmother was sentimental. She disliked humans. That improves the story. She said peace was trusting another species to hold up your ceiling. Outside, Imperial weapons fire vibrated through the station. I suddenly knew what a Shah would have done. That did not make it easier. I opened a station-wide channel. This is Engineer Jonah Quill. Central pressure seam is failing. Emergency cross-connections must open or Pelagic crown loses structural integrity. A Marine captain grabbed my shoulder. Those passages lead straight into Havoc's lines. Yes. You open them, he gets a clear route into the shelters. Yes. Can we reinforce first? No. How long? I checked the numbers. 7 minutes before the seam starts cascading. His face hardened. Then we hold the openings. That was the military answer. It was also the wrong one. Thousands of Imperial civilians were trapped beyond those same doors. If we filled the cross-connections with armed defenders, terrified civilians would be walking into a battlefield. I opened another channel. All weapons 20 meters back from the seam. The captain stared at me. You cannot be serious. I am. You're giving them the corridor. I'm giving everyone the corridor. Havoc will use it. Probably. And if he does. I looked at the pressure clock. Then at least Pelagic crown will still be here for us to fight about. The captain laughed once. No humor in it. A Shah really did leave me with lunatics. He ordered the Marines back. I began opening the seam. The first door moved 6 centimeters and stopped. Pressure screamed through the gap. Tavin and I forced the stabilizers manually. The second door opened. Then the third. Through the transparent walls beyond, I saw civilians. Hundreds. Virelans packed into Imperial-controlled passages. Waiting. Nobody had told them whether the humans on the other side would shoot. I stepped into the opening alone. Probably stupid. Maybe necessary. A Virellan woman stared at me. I pointed behind myself. Shelters are open. Nobody moved. Then a child ran. That was all it took. The crowd came through. Virellan families. Maintenance crews. Hospital patients. Government clerks. People who had spent their entire lives assuming the human alliance was as permanent as the ocean outside. Human medics took them. Our engineers directed them. Nobody asked which government they supported. The load across the seam began equalizing. Structural warnings dropped. Then Imperial troops appeared at the far end. My stomach turned cold. The Marine captain had kept his word. His soldiers remained back. HFY's troops marched forward through civilians. I saw weapons raised. I saw human defenders preparing. And then something unexpected happened. Several Imperial medics crossed the seam. Then technicians. Then uniformed officers. Then armed Virellan soldiers. They stopped on our side. I had seen some of them during earlier assaults. One still had blood on his armor. Human blood, maybe. He looked toward our Marines, then back toward the advancing Imperial formation. Slowly he turned around. So did the others. Weapons came up. Not at us. At HFY's troops. An officer shouted from the far side. You are ordered to return to Imperial control. Nobody moved. By authority of Prefect HFY, you are commanded to disarm. The Virellan soldier nearest me answered. No. One word. Quiet. Almost lost beneath the groaning station. But I felt it harder than the quake. The Imperial officer shouted again. You are soldiers of the Empire. The Virellan beside me tightened his grip on his rifle. Then the Empire should have protected them. He pointed toward the civilians still crossing. HFY's troops advanced. The first shot came from their side. This time there was no confusion. Former Imperial soldiers fired back. That was the moment I understood the tidal history would eventually give our disaster. Not when a shaft fell. Not when humans returned fire. Not even when Earth terminated the alliance. It ended there. At the seam. When soldiers who had worn the Imperial uniform their entire adult lives chose the people behind them over the authority in front of them. The old peace had depended on governments agreeing. Whatever came after would have to depend on something else. HFY's reinforcements never breached the shelters. Not because humanity destroyed them. Because the assault carriers above Pelagic Crown refused the final order. HFY commanded them to bombard human-controlled structural nodes. The carrier captains requested confirmation that civilian evacuation was complete. It was not. HFY repeated the order. They refused. He threatened execution. They still refused. One captain transmitted a short statement across every open channel. Pelagic Crown contains Imperial citizens. We will not preserve Imperial authority by destroying Imperial citizens. After that, the chain broke quickly. Not the Empire. Not yet. Empires are larger than one crisis. But obedience inside Pelagic Crown became conditional. And once authority becomes conditional, it discovers how much of its strength was borrowed. HFY evacuated aboard a loyal security craft. He left with his title, his guards, his legal seals. His authority over Pelagic Crown existed in every Imperial database. Nobody on the station cared. I watched his craft disappear upward through black water and realized that power could survive perfectly on paper after dying everywhere that mattered. Earth's declaration arrived 20 hours later. The human-Virellan strategic alliance was terminated. All joint commands were suspended. Human forces throughout Imperial territory were instructed to separate peacefully, where possible, and defend themselves where necessary. No promise of revenge. No declaration that the Virellans were monsters. No demand that every Imperial citizen choose sides. Just an ending. 9 centuries. Finished. There were people on Pelagic Crown who cried when the message played. Humans too. That surprised me. It should not have. We had lost something. Even justified endings are endings. Tavan stood beside me in Central Command, while engineering crews pumped seawater from the damaged floor. The old shared consoles were dead. Half their circuitry had burned during the fighting. Emergency lights reflected from a few centimeters of black water. The silver seam remained visible beneath the surface. Ashaz's blood was gone. I kept looking for it anyway. Tavan nudged my shoulder. You realize your people are leaving. Eventually. Most of the Imperial administration too. Probably. And this entire level has no defined authority. Sounds peaceful. He gave me a look, then pointed toward the old command chamber. Human relief workers had carried medical beds inside. Virellan medics were treating patients where admirals had once planned joint exercises. Children slept beneath dead tactical displays. Someone had hung thermal blankets over the Imperial crest because cold air was leaking through the wall behind it. 900 years of diplomacy reduced to insulation. I liked that more than I should have. Tavan stepped over the seam. Then back again. Still holding, he said. I looked down. The metal joint had survived the earthquake. The firefight. The pressure cascade. The end of an alliance. Of course it is. Why? Because we repaired it. He considered that. Then nodded. Outside the transparent wall, the ocean pressed against Pelagic Crown with enough force to erase us. It did not care who owned the city. It did not care which flag flew over command. It did not care that humans and Virellans had spent 9 centuries calling themselves allies, and one terrible day proving that alliances could die. The pressure simply remained. So did the people carrying it. The command stations never came back online. Weeks later, that chamber was still a clinic. Humans worked one side of the old seam. Virellans worked the other. And whenever someone needed something, they stepped across. No ceremony. No treaty. No permission. Just people refusing to let the ceiling fall. Commander Ashak Calder had been shot because an empire believed 9 centuries of peace meant it owned our obedience. Havoc kept his title. The empire kept its fleets. Humanity kept its anger. None of those things repaired Pelagic Crown. People did. The old peace was dead. We never pretended otherwise. But beneath 11 kilometers of ocean, the structure it had built was still holding. And for the first time in my life, I understood the difference.